General Hospital spoilers for Thursday, July 24 reveal that Nina was no longer the fragile woman clinging to redemption. She had crossed a line, stepped fully into the shadows of her own making. And what was once desperation had now curdled into something darker, control. After months of being cornered, judged, and discarded, especially by Willow, Nina had stopped trying to explain herself. The affair with Drew, though still a tightly held secret, had begun to shift her mindset entirely. It was no longer about avoiding exposure, it was about reshaping the narrative before anyone else could define her. And Willow, with her righteous fury and mounting suspicion, was quickly becoming the greatest threat to that narrative. Nina knew her daughter had already started piecing together fragments of the truth, strange glances, whispered conversations. The sudden change in Drew's behavior. But instead of retreating, Nina chose to strike first, covertly, emotionally. And with the cold precision of a woman who had lost too much and was no longer willing to lose again. This wasn't just about protecting her image. It was about reclaiming power in a world where she had been dismissed by nearly everyone, Willow, Carly, Sunny, even the Quartermaines. And now, with her affair threatening to detonate the fragile bridge she had rebuilt with Willow, Nina knew that playing the victim would no longer save her. She needed strategy. She needed manipulation. She needed silence. And she needed to keep Willow emotionally disoriented just long enough to regain control of the story. What began as subtle psychological warfare, passive-aggressive remarks, tears deployed at convenient moments, twisted reframing of past pain, was now evolving into something far more volatile. Nina began planting doubt, not just in Willow's view of her, but in her view of herself. She reminded Willow of her failures as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter. She preyed on Willow's guilt, her exhaustion, and her deep need to believe that family could still be salvaged after all the loss. Nina became the master of emotional contradictions, tender one moment, icy the next, keeping Willow off balance. Unsure of where her mother truly stood. And underneath it all, the affair with Drew continued like a slow-burning fuse, one that could blow everything apart the moment it was exposed. But Nina was ready. She had begun crafting her own version of events, rehearsing it in her mind. If the truth came out, she would say it was Drew who pursued her. That she was vulnerable. That she believed she and Willow had made progress, only to be rejected again. She would spin the narrative, weaponize her pain, and frame herself as the tragic consequence of being unloved. It wasn't honest. It wasn't right. But it was effective. And Nina had stopped caring about what was right the moment she realized that love alone would never be enough to keep Willow by her side. The tension between them was now so thick, even the smallest exchanges felt charged. A look across the room. A question that lingered too long. Willow was starting to pull away. Emotionally and physically, sensing something festering beneath the surface. She didn't know the full truth, yet, but she knew something was deeply wrong. And Nina, seeing her daughter's growing clarity, only tightened her grip. The relationship that once offered hope for reconciliation was now turning into a battlefield. Each interaction a skirmish between unspoken truth and unbearable silence. What made it all the more twisted was that, in her own way, Nina still believed she was protecting Willow. That by keeping the truth hidden, by managing the fallout preemptively, she was shielding her daughter from another collapse. But the deeper she sank into this delusion, the more toxic the relationship became. The mother who once begged for forgiveness was now a woman engineering emotional chaos to maintain control. And as the heat rose, as Willow's instincts sharpened, Nina's desperation took on a new shape, one that looked less like love and more like possession. The mother-daughter bond that had barely begun to heal was now buckling under the weight of secrets, lies, and unspoken rage. Willow could feel it, something dark was twisting inside Nina. Something that had nothing to do with reconciliation and everything to do with fear of abandonment. And as the truth edged closer to the surface, the emotional temperature in their relationship surged to a dangerous high. The days of cautious hope were gone. Now, every moment felt like it could be the one that shattered them for good. Nina wasn't just hiding an affair. She was constructing an empire of control, built on gaslight and guilt. Designed to keep Willow emotionally tethered while the truth festered just beneath the surface. But that truth, no matter how carefully buried, was coming. And when it arrived, the detonation wouldn't just destroy Nina's image, it would destroy the last fragile thread of love holding her and Willow together. And when that thread snapped, the woman Willow once tried to forgive would become the very person she could never trust again. The atmosphere was tense the moment Liesl and Liz crossed paths outside the reception hall, where the final preparations for Willow's wedding were underway. On the surface, it looked like a coincidence, two women orbiting the same event, both trying to maintain appearances. But beneath their polite nods and short pleasantries, something far more corrosive was bubbling. Both of them had seen too much. Both of them knew what the others pretended not to. And now, with Willow's wedding barreling toward disaster, Liesl and Liz found themselves drawn together not by friendship, but by a mutual disgust, a shared, quiet revulsion toward Drew and the twisted layers of manipulation he had wrapped himself in. Liesl, always sharp and unyielding in her opinions, had been harboring her doubts for weeks. There was something in Drew's eyes she didn't trust, a hollowness, a practiced smile that reminded her of men who wore masks for a living. She had seen the way he distanced himself from key conversations, how he redirected attention away from his past, how he never quite looked people like her in the eye. The final straw for Liesl had been Britt's hidden files, fragments of medical data, coded correspondence, and off-the-record confessions that hinted at a horrifying possibility, that Drew, the man standing at the altar, might not be Drew at all. And even if he was, Liesl suspected he was hiding actions so vile that the truth would leave Willow broken. Liz, meanwhile, had grown uneasy in quieter, more intuitive ways. She had treated Drew once, long ago, in moments where his defenses were down, when his trauma bled through his words. But lately, something about him had shifted, his temper, his demeanor, his calculated affection. Liz, ever the observer, watched him rehearse love like a performance, not an emotion. And when she heard whispers from the WSB, when Anna slipped her a question laced with warning, Liz began connecting the dots. The man Willow was marrying wasn't just emotionally unavailable, he was spiritually vacant. And the danger wasn't abstract anymore. It was standing in front of them, dressed in a tuxedo, preparing to claim Willow's future. Their shared disgust wasn't loud or dramatic. It manifested in glances, in hushed conversations behind floral arrangements. In the way Liesl's voice dropped an octave whenever Drew's name was mentioned. For the first time, Liesl and Liz weren't divided by their differences in temperament or history, they were united by one common goal, to stop a mistake from becoming a catastrophe. The wedding wasn't just a romantic ceremony anymore. It had become a ticking bomb, and the more they watched Willow glow in innocent hope, the more Liesl and Liz felt sick to their stomachs. Liesl, never one to hold back, began crafting a contingency plan. If the wedding went forward, she would be ready to confront Drew publicly, not with speculation, but with proof. She had pulled strings, contacted former WSB associates, and even traced the odd pattern of Drew's travel history. There were discrepancies too large to ignore. And if she had to be the villain in Willow's fairy tale to stop this marriage, she would do it without hesitation. Liz, more careful and emotionally tied to Willow, tried a gentler approach. She quietly warned Willow to reconsider rushing into marriage. She pointed out inconsistencies, framed them as concern rather than alarm. But Willow, blinded by her desperate need for peace and family, brushed them off with grace. And that only deepened Liz's dread. Because once Willow said, "I do," the illusion would be complete, and unraveling it would be 10 times harder. Together, Liesl and Liz understood what was at stake. Willow's health, her child, her emotional future, all of it was being wagered on a man neither of them could trust. And while the rest of Port Charles celebrated love and unity, these two women watched from the margins, calculating how best to dismantle the lie without destroying the woman they both cared for. Their alliance, born of repulsion, became one of the most unlikely and dangerous in Port Charles. Liesl, the sharp scalpel. Liz, the steady hand. And Drew, unaware that behind the lace and vows, a reckoning was being quietly prepared in the shadows. What had begun as a wedding was becoming an intervention. And if the truth surfaced before Willow said, "I do," it would be because Liesl and Liz refused to let silence bury what needed to be exposed. Willow shared a tender, almost dreamlike moment with Scout, a moment so pure, so unexpectedly powerful, that it shifted something deep within her. In the quiet hush of a sunlit room, away from the escalating chaos surrounding the wedding, the two sat together over a shared cup of tea and a stack of hand-drawn pictures. Scout, with her curious eyes and hesitant smile, spoke about things she missed, bedtime stories, warm hugs, someone to sit with her during storms. It wasn't just small talk. It was confession. And as Willow listened, something inside her cracked wide open. Not from sadness, but from connection. From recognition. This wasn't just Drew's daughter anymore, this was a child reaching out to her in trust, in hope. In silent longing for the mother figure she had been quietly craving. For Willow, who had lived through loss after loss, from harmony to her own health crisis, to the emotional distance with Wiley and Amelia, this moment wasn't just healing. It was transformational. In Scout's presence, she didn't feel like a woman lost in uncertainty. She felt grounded. Needed. Alive. The small hand that reached for hers wasn't just a gesture of affection, it was a bond being formed in real time. A bridge between two souls scarred by grief and yet still capable of choosing love. This new dynamic with Scout ignited something fierce and beautiful in Willow. She felt protective in a way that was immediate and consuming. But more than that, she felt inspired to be better, to fight harder, to believe again in the possibility of family. The emotional intimacy forming between them was no longer just a byproduct of the wedding plans, it had become the core of everything. And as Scout leaned against her shoulder, whispering a wish that, maybe this time, things can stay good, Willow closed her eyes and silently promised she would do everything in her power to make that wish come true. But what neither of them could see was how this innocent moment of bonding was the beginning of something far more explosive. Because the stronger Willow's attachment to Scout grew, the more clearly she saw the cracks in the foundation she was about to build her life on. She began questioning the reality around her, Drew's behavior, the secrets others whispered about, the subtle warnings she had brushed aside. Scout had unknowingly become the compass pulling her toward truth. And the more love Willow gave to her, the more clarity she gained about the world crumbling around them. This connection wasn't just emotional, it was catalytic. It changed the stakes. Now, Willow wasn't walking toward the altar just as a bride. She was walking as a woman ready to protect the heart of a child who had entrusted her with more than just affection, a child who had given her back her purpose. And in doing so, Scout had unknowingly helped light the fuse to a truth that would soon detonate everything. What had started as a sweet moment between almost stepmother and child had now become the epicenter of a quiet emotional revolution. Willow was no longer sleepwalking through wedding plans. She was awake. She was watching. And as her bond with Scout deepened, so did her certainty that something about all of this, about Drew, about the silence in Carly's eyes, about the undercurrent of tension in every conversation, was dangerously wrong. This wasn't just love anymore. It was instinct. And when Willow finally followed that instinct to its conclusion, the eruption that followed would shake not only her relationship, but the very foundation of the family she thought she was about to build. And in the center of it all, holding her hand, would be Scout, the child who gave her clarity, courage, and a reason to choose truth over illusion. Trina stood her ground with unwavering resolve, her voice calm but unshakable, her gaze fixed and clear. No matter how much pressure Kai applied, no matter how loud his emotions surged, how aggressively he demanded answers or pled for reconciliation, Trina didn't flinch. She had reached a breaking point, not in anger, but in clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when love has been worn thin by obsession, when boundaries have been crossed too many times. And when trust, once fractured, simply refuses to heal. Kai was unraveling before her eyes, and Trina, once patient and hopeful, could see it for what it truly was, the final, painful unraveling of what they had tried so hard to salvage. Kai's emotions had always run hot, but now they were boiling over, not just in frustration, but in a darker, more chaotic energy. His jealousy, his need for control, his inability to accept Trina's independence were no longer just traits, they had become weapons. And Trina, tired of defending her choices, tired of explaining her worth, had finally said enough. In her silence, in her refusal to bend, Kai saw the end. And that made him explode. He accused. He shouted. He reminded her of their history. Of the promises they once whispered in the dark. But Trina didn't move. She didn't recoil. Because she had seen the signs for months, the way Kai twisted her autonomy into betrayal. The way he masked insecurity with affection, the way he let his fear of losing her justify emotional warfare. Trina had loved Kai, deeply. But now, all she felt was exhaustion. And with every word Kai hurled, he only confirmed what she had already accepted, this wasn't love anymore. This was obsession. Their final confrontation wasn't a dramatic, tearful goodbye. It was a severing. A clean, deliberate cut. Trina told him, with piercing calm, that whatever they once had was over. That she no longer saw a future built on apologies that came too late or passion that burned too violently. Kai tried to reach for her, not physically, but emotionally. Throwing desperate words like lifelines. But none of them landed. Trina's heart had already let go. And as she turned and walked away, the devastation on Kai's face was immediate. But beneath the heartbreak was something more dangerous, a growing obsession, a dark, seething ache that didn't want to accept the end. That moment marked more than just a breakup. It ignited a new kind of madness inside him, the kind that refuses to let go, the kind that turns longing into fixation. Trina didn't look back. Because she knew that if she did, if she gave him one more second, one more ounce of her heart, she'd be pulled back into a cycle that would never stop hurting. Her strength wasn't cold. It was necessary. And now, as she walked forward into an unknown future, she carried something Kai never expected, peace. But for Kai, left behind in the wreckage, peace would never come. Only obsession. Only the gnawing need to rewrite the ending Trina had already closed. And that need, unchecked, could lead to a far more dangerous path than either of them were ready for. Alexis sat across from Drew, her tone deceptively calm, but her eyes sharp with unspoken fire. The room was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of quiet that settles before a storm, and Drew, sensing the weight in Alexis's voice, finally sat down. What began as a conversation disguised in civility quickly shifted into something far more piercing. Alexis wasn't here for pleasantries, she was here because the truth had started to rot in silence, and the scent of it had grown too pungent to ignore. She had been watching Drew closely. More closely than anyone realized, and the contradictions in his words, the shadows in his expressions, were no longer just troubling. They were terrifying. She began carefully, threading her words with calculated precision. But underneath every syllable was accusation. Alexis spoke of inconsistencies, of timelines that didn't add up, of decisions Drew had made that no longer aligned with the man she once knew. Her voice never raised, but her intensity burned. She recounted whispers from the WSB, off-the-record briefings. Rumors of compromised identities and unethical operations. But it wasn't just what she had heard, it was what she had felt. The man in front of her, the man who had once been a hero, now radiated something colder, something stranger. Drew no longer hesitated when manipulating someone. He no longer flinched when speaking of moral sacrifice. It was as if his soul had been quietly recalibrated for something darker, something irreversible. Drew tried to defend himself, tried to cloak his choices in duty, in sacrifice, in strategy. But Alexis wasn't buying it. Because she knew what guilt looked like. She had lived inside it. And what she saw in Drew's face wasn't just guilt. It was calculation. It was emptiness hidden behind duty. She pressed him on specific events, demanded clarity, asked why certain people had disappeared after missions Drew had touched. She brought up Brit. She brought up the WSB's experimental operations, ones Drew had allegedly been part of during his disappearance, operations that had left bodies behind and identities destroyed. And then Alexis said what she had been holding in for weeks, "I don't think you're the same man who came back from that island." The words hit the air like a detonation. Drew's expression flickered for just a moment, a flash of something between fear and rage, and that flicker was all Alexis needed. She had seen it. She had confirmed what she had always feared. Something inside him was broken. Or perhaps something darker had taken root and grown silently while no one was looking. This wasn't just a moral conversation. This was a reckoning. Alexis had her own obsessions, with justice, with truth, with redemption. But now those obsessions were being tested against the horrifying possibility that Drew wasn't just hiding secrets, he was one. And in that moment, sitting across from the man who once risked everything for others, Alexis realized she might be speaking to someone capable of crimes far beyond what Port Charles had seen. And that realization chilled her to the bone. Their conversation ended without resolution. Drew stood, colder than before, offering no apology, no explanation. Alexis remained seated, stunned into silence, watching the door close behind him. The man who left that room was not the one who entered, or maybe, she thought, that man had never truly come back from Greece at all. And now, her obsession wasn't just uncovering the truth. It was surviving it. Because if Drew was the danger she suspected, the damage had already begun. And stopping it might be more impossible than she ever imagined.